I've already covered the basics of Realms and Ruin in a previous video, so today we're going to go in depth with a faction guide. Thanks to your voting, we're starting with the Disciples of Tzeentch, so let's waste no more time and dive right in, starting with the units. First up we have the Hores of Sing. These are a tier 1 ranged units and have no extra skills. Honestly, it's hard to use them badly since these guys are just that good. Their ideal position is attacking enemies from a range, shockingly enough, being a ranged unit. They deal decent damage and can take down most early troops with relative ease. If they get caught in melee, their damage output does fall, but they're not useless by any means. As each entity dies, it splits into a smaller version, with the final Brimstone version leaping at nearby enemies, dealing almost guaranteed damage if they're in melee. These would be the perfect unit if it wasn't for the fact that once they split to anything below pink horrors, they cannot be healed or reinforced, meaning most damage they take ends up being permanent, meaning you can either make your peace with losing the unit once it gets into melee, or retreat them at the first sign of trouble to keep them in tip-top shape. Whichever you choose, they'll serve you well and beat almost anything you put them up against early on. Speaking of choice, their tier 2 tech comes a little bit late since I like to phase them out quickly, but if not, then honestly, both are great, but I'd go with damage. They have a decent range as is, so you may as well amp up the damage, rather than have them stood even further back. Next up with the Kyri Acolytes, and these are a tier 1 assault unit. They come with the Gestalt Sorcery passive ability, which grants them increased damage whilst above 50% HP, as well as a charge. These are your early game melee troop, with not a lot of toughness or damage output, but they're your only melee option, so suck it up. They're actually very useful for holding enemies back and charging into ranged troops to shut them down, whilst your heroes and horrors come in to deal all of the real damage. They really are designed to work alongside other units, so absolutely do this to get most value out of them. Get them to clump up enemies for a big hero cast or range barrage, and send them back to heal up regularly to make the most of that Gestalt Sorcery. Speaking of clumps, their bombardment can do great versus those, so once unlocked through technology, be sure to let them loose before entering combat to maximise their damage output, all whilst being safely at range. The tier 3 Sorceress Fusillade, which increases the bolts fired in the area of effect and damage, if you ask me, comes a little bit late because at that point I'd rather have better units, but if you want some very cheap units with some very high barraging range damage and some decent frontlines capability, then I suppose you can use them all the way into the endgame. Magister is our final tier 1 unit, and it is of course the hero of the faction. It comes with a couple of abilities right out the gate. Shield of Fate passively grants shields to nearby allied units whilst not in combat, which carries over into combat, and Gift of Tzeentch, which deals damage in an expanding tier area whilst healing any allies in that same area. As I said, this is your starting hero and the workhorse of the game for Tzeentch. This guy mainly wants to be used in a support position, moving to use his ability to hit as many enemies and allies as possible to deal damage and heal units. He also deals some decent range damage, but just be careful of the shorter range, as it can easily get roped into melee where he will not fare too greatly without heavy support. Personally, I just retreat him if he gets stuck in melee and bring him back once he's in fighting form, as the damage output and defense really is not there, and you're pretty much wasting the backbone of your army. For the tech choice at tier 1, it's pretty simple. If you need more range damage, then go Infusion. If your troops are dying too fast and you need extra healing, go Bounty. Both are great in their own way, just one requires ability usage and one is just extra damage. And lastly at tier 3, gaining the Disc of Tzeentch allows flight and increased movement speed, so pretty much no downsides if you have the Realm Stone to spare. Kicking off tier 2, we have the Sangals, and these are our first heavy unit. They start with the Destined Mayhem passive, which allows them to gain attack speed whilst nearby to hero units. These are your mid-game line holders with much improved survivability over the Acolytes. Their damage isn't anything to shout about, but they can hold enemies in place for a very long time, allowing ranged units to come in and deal all the damage you could ever need. I'd advise against using them alone unless you're just buying time, as they'll most likely lose against most units of a similar tier, even if it does take a very long time for that to happen. For their tech choices, it's a tough one. The bonus defense and unstoppable whilst near to heroes is great if they're near to heroes, but if not, then they're getting no benefit. Savagery is much easier to manage, even if the actual effects of Destined Mayhem are better, so that'd probably be my go-to in most situations. Overall, these are a great frontline troop as part of a coordinated force, so just make sure they have high damage allies, and they should do great. Next up we have the Screamers of Tzeentch. These are a tier 2 assault unit, and they come with the Slashing Charge ability. This allows them to deal damage and reduce armor of enemies in a target area by charging in. Just be aware this does have a bit of a travel time, so you kind of have to anticipate where enemies are going to be, and you can very easily miss if they decide to, well, not be there. These are a great fast-moving flanky unit. You want to use their flight and high speed against enemy backlines and shut them down to take out any ranged threats before they can get much value. Using their slashing charge to engage allows them to deal great burst damage and follow up with more to wipe out most single threats in moments. Just be careful they don't get pinned down and focused either by range or surrounded in melee, as their defense does not match their damage, so they can quickly go down if left in heavy combat. Don't be afraid to pull them out if you need to, as their high speed and flight lets them get back into the action all the way from base in no time. As for their tech choices, both are strong and all really depends who you're up against. If you find yourself being beaten by spells, then the silence can be great. Otherwise, you can't go wrong with passive effects on your attacks. Closing out tier 2, we have the Flamers of Tzeentch, and these are a ranged unit. They start with the Bounding Warp Flame ability. This allows them to leap to a target location and leave behind a patch of Warp Flame. While not as overpowered for their tier as Horrors, these are still a great upgrade for their range damage alone. If they can get shots off, their damage output is extremely high and can wipe most enemies out in moments. Of course, this normally means pairing them up with some Sangals to keep enemies back, but if you can manage that, they'll do all the heavy lifting damage-wise. Now, they're not without downsides. Their short range makes getting risk-free shots off a lot harder and leaves them vulnerable to being pulled into melee through proximity alone. Once in melee, their damage and defense is pitiful, so retreat is your only option. Add on the fact that they're hardly the quickest units in the world, and you're looking at quite a lot of downtime if they even get brushed with melee damage. Their Bounding Warp Flame ability seems like a good idea to deal damage in an area, but I don't really use it to move them to safe locations if enemies are moving in. Otherwise, they'll end up in melee, and we just covered how great they are at that. However, if you choose to pick up their Touched by Fire ability, the massive area damage in a massive area is pretty top tier, provided you can find a group of enemies big enough to use it on. If not, then extended range and damage is never a bad thing. As I said, their base range is fairly short, so extending it is definitely advisable if you are struggling with them getting pulled into combat. Kicking off tier 3, we have Sangal Skyfires, and these are another ranged unit that start with flight thanks to their Discs of Tzeentch. Now, if you're looking for the maximum possible range you can get in the faction, then look no further. These flying ranged units have pretty insane range, allowing them to fire on enemies from almost half the map away. Now, their damage output isn't beating Flamers, but they can deal it from much further away and from a much safer location in the sky, where only other flyers or ranged units can touch them. Add on to this their high speed due to the flight, and they're a very elusive ranged unit for enemies to shut down. Of course, if they do get caught out either by flyers or somehow grounded, they're pretty much glass cannons, so want to be pulled out as soon as possible to keep them safe. Similar to Screamers, their fast flight speed allows them to get back into the fight nice and quickly anyway, so better to bring them back to deal range damage than have them die attempting to do anything in melee. If you're struggling with them getting shut down by other flyers, simply keep them grounded nearby to allies to deter or at least deal with this when it happens by trapping enemies in melee with grounded troops. Lastly, they have a tier 3 Research, Judgment from Afar, which gains them the active ability to monitor a distant location and fire on enemies that enter it from extremely far away. Next we have the Ogro thorge. This is a tier 3 assault unit. It starts with a number of abilities. After taking enough damage, Brutal Rage activates and it gains increased damage and movement speed, as well as access to the Mighty Rampage ability. However, it loses Choking Tendrils. Speaking of which, Mighty Rampage is basically just a meaty charge, which seems to be pretty much impossible to use since it needs to have taken damage to be in the rage, but chances are if it's taking damage, it's in melee, and it can't use the ability anyway. Choking Tendrils, however, deals damage and slows units in a target's area whilst healing for every unit hit, so it's very useful for dealing some damage from a range, as well as getting some health back. Now, this may be classed as an assault unit, but it is basically a hero because it can do a whole bunch of things. It's super tanky, great damage from a range or in melee, and it has powerful abilities. Be sure to engage from a range initially, especially against non-ranged troops, to get off some free damage. Once things do get into melee, it'll keep the value coming, so just give it support by keeping enemy ranged at bay, and it should do great. Honestly, not really a bad way to use this guy outside of standing still waiting to be taken apart by enemy ranged. Just make sure to use their abilities for extra damage, both in melee or at range, to make the absolute most of their kit that you can, because the kit itself is pretty top tier. And our final unit is, of course, the Lord of Change, and this is a tier 3 hero. This also starts with a number of abilities. The Rod of Sorcery fires a bolt to a target location, dealing damage to enemies caught in the target's area. Infernal Gateway creates a slowly widening area of effect, dealing massive damage over time and slowing enemies caught inside. And Beacon of Sorcery creates an aura that increases allied damage and silences enemies after any ability cast. Finally, the big boy of Tzeentch, and it is a very big boy. Honestly, probably the most underwhelming unit in the roster. Don't get me wrong, it's good, but basically it's because of the abilities. Both are great for more focused damage or eliminating everything on the screen, including your frames, but there's one simple problem. All of this casting can only be done from outside of melee, and this is a melee unit with no ranged attacks. AKA, you have to keep this guy set out of combat, contributing nothing to even have the option to use his abilities. Don't get me wrong, once in melee, it's alright. But honestly, why can't I use these bahonking abilities whilst he's there? It's not like he's a ranged unit and I'm asking him to whip out the bow in close quarters. Anyway, use the gateway to clear the screen of as many enemies as you can fit in the radius, and then take out the remainder of the enemy's base as casually as you like. Keep it out of melee until you've used all the abilities that you want, and for God's sake don't misclick, as these are some hefty costs and cooldowns, and you have a long time to think about your mistakes. Of course, alongside units, Tzeentch also has access to a number of bastions that they can craft on arcane conduits to keep them safe, gain resources, and much, much more. First up, we have the Tome of the Demonic Simulacrum. Tome of the Demonic Simulacrum, and this is the damage/defense bastion. When built, this attacks enemies within a target area. This area reveals the Fog of War and also can be moved, and it increases in size and damage as the bastion area of control grows. It can be upgraded to also allow it to target flying units, and through research can gain the Demonic Reinforcement ability, which allows it to summon a unit of some Hores of Sing. The Silver Tower Tether is the Realmstone harvesting building. It increases Realmstone income depending on the area of control up to 10, and upgrading it increases its maximum to 25. And through research can gain Tether defenses, which now grants it an aura to deal damage to nearby enemies. The Altar of Tzeentch is the healing bastion. This heals and reinforces nearby allied units, and increases the unit's summoning capacity, allowing you to recruit multiple units at once. The upgrades allow you to summon 2 extra units at once, and it has no research. Finally, the Eye of Tzeentch is the ward/command bastion. This removes the fog of war within the area of effect and increases command gain based on the area up to 9. The upgrade increases the max command production to 15 and allows one more research project to be worked on simultaneously. It also gains the Glimpse of the Plan ability, which reveals an area of the map removing the fog of war temporarily. Lastly, we have the faction ability, and this is the Plea to the Silver Tower. This summons a slow moving beam of light to travel down a target area, dealing massive damage to any enemies caught inside whilst healing allies. It's very slow moving, and you have to make sure that it's going in the right direction so that it heals/damages the right things at the right time. Honestly, just aim for the biggest blob of yours and the enemy units that you can, and you can't go wrong. And that is everything that there is to know about the Disciples of Tzeentch in Realms of Ruin. Let me know what you think of the faction in the comments below. Like, subscribe, and if you want more Realms of Ruin content, then check out this video here to see my complete beginner's guide.